We must speak the truth about terrorism. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No collusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Welcome to the Antedote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Gushel.
As we are recording, it is Sunday, November 1st, 3 p.m. Central Time out here in the heartland of America. And we are 2 days away from election 2020. And
well, election 2020 may just end up going through 2021.
That actually is true. Yeah, there's a good chance that we may know nothing after. There's a good chance we may know nothing after by midnight on November 4th. So, but officially, it's supposed to be, like, symbolically, at least speaking, traditionally, it's the election day. I mean, it could be 2000 all over again, or it could even be something else, or it could end up just playing out. I don't know, but I mean, I'm definitely, like, scenarios we've never seen before cannot be ruled out. Certainly in this particular event. So
no, that's true. I mean, what's interesting is that now, like, the whole idea of 11/9 for the 2016 thing, that was actually right the next day after the Tuesday of the election voting in November of 2016. But it was the date when it was announced that Trump had been, quote unquote, elected, i.e. installed. And to this day, there's still zero coverage of, is it really the case that, like, these key swing states, Trump just sort of eked out at the end, even in the face of the actual evidence of potential machine rigging and election fraud? Or was it, as we've seen from before, something like a 2004, where the key battleground states are rigged by the operators? And it's in terms of 2016, fairly actually the same kind of operators, if you're looking at someone like Paul Manafort, in relationship to people like Mike Connell. And of course, back in 2004, Manafort was more oriented towards his work in Ukraine on behalf of such oligarchs as Dmitry Firtash and their choice for leadership in Ukraine. But at the very same time, Mike Connell had been working on behalf of Rove as Rove's IT guru in relationship to the question of smart tech servers. And remember that part of the architecture of 2004 was Ken Blackwell holding down the operation as the Secretary of State, right, Greg, of Ohio?
Secretary of State of Ohio, yes. And there's some very interesting information. By the way, just real quick on Ken Blackwell, some of the, I don't have it in front of me, but there's really detailed information on, like, tactics that Ken Blackwell specifically used in Ohio, in urban areas such as Cleveland in particular, in the Craig Unger book, Boss Rove. I was reading that at the public library a while back, reading through that before everything got shut down, and now you can't go to the library without an appointment. But I'd like to maybe go back to that at some point, like, as far as, like, actually, like, really, like, a breakdown of what Ken Blackwell was specifically doing in terms of ensuring that there were not as many places to vote in these particular urban areas in Cleveland, African-American primary populations. And so I'd like to go back to that at some point in the future, but obviously the big point is, like, the players from 2004 and also from 2000. I mean, you consider Roger Stone, the Brooks Brothers riots, going out onto the InfoWars airwaves. You don't know if he's bluffing or if he's dead serious, but, like, this idea of, let's invoke the Insurrection Act and start, rounding up people and arresting people and getting Bob Barr to oversee, I don't know if they're bluffing or not, but, the players are still at play. I mean, this is 2004 operations all over again to a large extent. With obviously we go to 2004 though, particularly with Rove and with Blackwell in key positions. You have to look at that. This is the extension of the operation, as it was pointed out on the podcast Gaslit Nation with Sarah Kendzior and Andrea Chalupa. The Trump presidency, ultimately what led to it began from a domestic government perspective. With the events of Florida in December of 2000. So, and you see the players that are involved in all of this, Florida 2000, Ohio 2004, and you definitely see that this operation is still really in full force. The the deepest levels domestically of the Bush reelection operation.
And the meat and potatoes of a 21st century American election, at the very least, in terms of the way the dynamics, the partisan dynamics we've seen, is what you're talking about is the meat and potatoes of the Roves and the Blackwells, which is targeted and very specific voter suppression. And then now in the day and age of Trump, we see that that's always coupled with the accusation of voter fraud, right? And we're even seeing that right now at some level in terms of this early Harris County in Texas, where it's been brought to a judge to actually erase 100,000 something votes that have already been taken place because they were done, from a unique process from cars. And this is actually, we're going to be seeing more of this. So we'll deal with this more when we deal with the question of the courts and the Supreme Court, especially as we see what specific role the Supreme Court might play in terms of this election, whether it's going to be immediate or whether it'll be the longer term scenario. But at the very least, we should notate that this looks to be the path that the current sort of Republican operatives are operating within in terms of the election, is they are going to be trying to use the courts to say that the, CNP, Koch-owned, some of the state legislatures are allowed to override the state judiciaries and state executive branches, even post facto, in terms of the announcement of whether it's when votes that were sent, ballots that were sent in the mail will be counted, or in this Harris County, Texas version, whether they'll be erased because the legislature has a beef with the process or something like that. So meat and potatoes is voter suppression using limited access to polling stations. In 2016, we saw it even in terms of Cambridge Analytica, that was the key psychometrics push by the Cambridge Analytica process, was to suppress certain populations from voting, disgruntled Bernie Sanders voters, African Americans, and suburban women specifically, right? And you see that that's still, even there seems to be a replica of that this time around. And at the same time, the meat and potatoes of the Democrat side of this is that they are willing to talk all day about voter suppression. Everyone from quote unquote alternative media people like Greg Palast to even DNC new darlings such as Stacey Abrams, or even I would point to Bernie Sanders' ex-press secretary Simone Sanders, now with the Biden camp, and that the thing that remaining on the reservation is you have to not talk about anything about election fraud, even if it's front and center. And even as we know now that John Kerry himself knew in 2004 that the dynamics for election fraud were at play, especially in Ohio. So that I think that's going on. And so look for that combination of dynamics to be at play. Now, I see there a sort of a stark bimodal, a sort of a split in the road, basically, about the way that this could go down on Tuesday into the future. And both seem plausible to me. One is that as things seem to have been heading in terms of what Trump has been saying, the stochastic prodding of everyone from, the sort of Proud Boys to basic MAGA with the ISIS-style convoys and all of that, without the technicals, at least at this point, to even people like Stuart Rhodes, Oath Keepers on Alex Jones, talking about special forces being activated to go after the command and control structure of Antifa.
Kind of similar. It's almost similar to like Roger Stone and the Insurrection Act and Bob Barr overseeing like, which tech giants, who are we going to arrest and all this and that. It kind of sounds similar to that. And it's very interesting because that's one of the things that like you think about that the kind of like almost like this is I don't want to cut you off there, but
no, go for it.
This is like that kind of like aspect of like the right-wing alt media and, typical, Mark Levin style mainstream media kind of nexus is that there's, we're coming together where varying narratives, but the bigger narrative is in place. This very well is something that could happen. It's like this major, crackdown on like these domestic enemies. So everybody from like the Mark Levins to even Trump himself on Judge Jeanine's Pirro show to Roger Stone to someone like Stuart Rhodes, Oath Keepers, is throwing that narrative out there. And also I will throw in even Donald Trump Jr. calling for people to go and guard the election sites to make sure nothing nefarious goes on.
So I think that is very plausible, that the architecture of that is not just huffing and puffing, and that there is a lot already in place, from this Texas move to the Supreme Court. Kavanaugh, really dicey, shady decision that he made in relationship to Pennsylvania, I think. And Pennsylvania may become crucial. Pennsylvania may be the new Ohio this year, actually, probably. I can imagine that happening. And so there's that. But then when you add on top of this what we've been talking about in terms of this sort of the announcements of things of like stochastic sedition, even, and if you would want to think about it as sort of pushing the parameters of a civil war kind of scenario, under which such things as activating sort of independent militia or veteran special forces, or the more moderated sort of Bill Barrs and Roger Stone saying, okay, at least it'll be done under the Insurrection Act or something, these kinds of things. It may not be bluster if we go down the route as it sort of looks like it might be, depending on the backers of Trump, I think, and how much much courage they have to back their guy at this point. And remember, there is indicators that Trump himself was not totally committed, or didn't even think that he was necessarily going to win in 2016. And then it appears that whoever backed him put him in at some level. And so that is the question here. And so just a few more indicators that might be the way that we're headed is the network of the hardcore folks, such as Karl Rove, just today on Fox News. He's on with Chris Wallace.
Deep state demon whose father took photos with Donald Trump on Robert Maxwell's yacht. And if Bill Clinton had done that, you'd never hear the end of it.
It's true. So there's Rove on Fox News, who seems to be angling for these other sets of polls that he's looking at that says it's going to be close, and Trump is on the rise again like he was in 2016 and all of that. And then you couple that with someone like John McLaughlin, who's someone we've talked about a bit, who was a Arthur Finkelstein mentee, part of the Finky Kids network, but also came straight out of Bibi Netanyahu's employment in Israel as his political advisor / pollster, and to then go and work in Trump 2016 campaign. And it is interesting. He was the only one on that panel, the post quote unquote election panel in 2016, where I asked both campaigns and the mainstream media about, shouldn't the American people have been told that they basically had a selection between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, both people deeply entwined, if not compromised, by apparent Israeli intelligence asset Jeffrey Epstein's blackmail operation. And there was total silence. And then finally, when it became so uncomfortable that no one rejected the assertions that I was making, finally, McLaughlin, of both camps and the media people, he was the only one that spoke out. And he finally got the gumption to say, that's just ridiculous, and nothing you said is true. And so that was pretty interesting. And then afterward, followed up with him and Glassner. And Glassner really avoided it. And I asked Glassner whether this was a Netanyahu operation. And I believe I didn't know at that time that McLaughlin had been straight coming out of working with Netanyahu to the campaign. And I just based that on terms of the Epstein relationship there. So and also what I knew of Glassner's background in terms of working with Louis Eisenberg at the Port Authority during the time the real estate was transferred to Larry Silverstein, who was talking to Netanyahu every Sunday for years up through September 11th and all of that. So McLaughlin is also on social media pushing polls that he says show that it's actually there's a transfer of momentum right now to Trump in all of the battleground states, basically. And then the final piece of this sort of, let's call it a troika from Karl Rove to John McLaughlin to then Uri Geller. I think it was Chris, right? Chris Rouleau showed us, right, Greg?
Yes. He, our mutual friend and researcher extraordinaire, sent us Uri Geller tweeting his prediction, the Israeli-born magician's prediction of Trump.
And Uri Geller, to me, is he's a window to the deep state Israeli motive often, and he pops in at certain political times to deliver these kinds of messages. And of course, this is a very, let's backtrack a little bit here in terms of the layers of what these people represent. Karl Rove represents the actual political operative, the political strategist, the political campaign operative, right? The guy who will use every and all tactics to whether it's, from accusing John McCain of having illegitimate black children, I think was one of the ones that he was involved in, right? So that's very Finky. That's sort of Finky kid sort of. Everyone
from Karl Rove to Jerome Corsi running dirty operations against the Kerry campaign.
So that's an advisor. Remember Rove's role in George W. Bush, right? It's really spanned the terrain, and it wasn't just limited to elections. It was also post-election, how to work. I believe Rove was behind a lot of the cynical use of the evangelical Christians, not just in this Trump era, but back to George W. Bush. Remember those allegations? I believe that was Rove in the midst there, which of course also lines up with Rove's cynical use of the apparent true believer status of someone like Mike Connell, who I believe was a devout Catholic actually, and who allegedly believed that the ends justified the means in terms of his pro-life religious convictions, in terms of why he would then be involved in something like election fraud, machine rigging at the level of someone like Karl Rove's IT guru. And then he's then liquidated in a apparent black op plane crash in the run-up to legal accounting for that, depositions and investigations into that matter, but 4 years later, basically. So with Rove, you have an operative level, a pervasive operative. Then you move to someone like McLaughlin, John McLaughlin, and you're totally in the realm of what's known as the pollsters, who are replete on the mainstream media from who's that guy? Who's that other Finky kid who's always George something, who's always on Fox News? I forget. But the point I want to make is that polling and pollsters is a key piece of information warfare in all of this. It's really used as magical conditioning, and everyone who's concerned in whatever sort of quote unquote side they're on in this election has some stance on the polling, right? The polls. What do the polls say? Are the polls all wrong like they were in 2016? Are they underplaying how much a lead Biden has? Or, what is the role of polls? And really, I've said this before, especially I think when we did from 9/11 to 11/9, that I believe polling is actually information warfare, right? So the polling, for example, if you even think to the relationship of Paul Manafort, right? What they say that Paul Manafort did in terms of delivering information to Kalimnik. And maybe, Greg, if you can remember to bring us back around to these newest revelations in terms of some of the Manafort interview information around not only Kalimnik and Cambridge Analytica and the role of people like Kellyanne Conway in scripting messages for suburban women using Cambridge Analytica, but also George Nader at the epicenter of bringing together people like Well, let's break that sort of down real quickly right now, and then let's return to the meat of this. But just to make sure that we have that aspect on the table, Greg, will you go over just some of what the George Nader stuff is, and then we'll return to this question of polling?
Sure, and I don't have everything in front of me right now, but this is based off of the work, or as far as like the research or work that Marcy Wheeler at Empty Wheel on Twitter has done with looking into some of these more. And what exactly were the? Do you remember exactly what the documents were?
This was I think it was 1,000 pages of what are known as 302s, I think, which are FBI investigation, interview, raw data. They're almost sort of like raw intelligence reports, but they're based on FBI interviews. And in this case, I think they were based on the deeper Mueller investigation about what they were looking into. And I think it's what's his name, Jason.
I'm sorry, Jason Leopold with BuzzFeed.
Yeah, and they call him a FOIA terrorist. I think he's been called some because he's of any reporter in the world. He individually he has been able to release thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of these documents. And so this is from Marcy Wheeler's investigation into these very recently in the last few days released 1,000-something pages.
By the way, I'm just going to read a tweet real quick that I think lays this out as far as perfectly what we were going to get into with the with this very significant, what you just teased just a minute ago, a very significant, I would say, vitally important information that came out of this 1,000 pages. But I'm just going to read this tweet real quick from Marcy Wheeler as of yesterday. Re-up just for Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald. What they've been missing while they've been making stuff up. Child rapist George Nader introduced Dick Cheney and Ahmad Chalabi.
Oh, I thought Russiagate was a nothing burger.
I wonder if Eli Lake knows about George Nader's role as brokering the Chalabi-Cheney relationship and through that the Iraq War. Eli Lake, a neocon turned Greenwald defender.
So this is a crucial fact, right? Because especially in terms of the way that Marcy Wheeler lays it out there around people who are supposedly now left critics of the Iraq War, right? Someone like Glenn Greenwald, for example, that the data surrounding Russiagate is a conspiracy theory and totally debunked, even according to people like Aaron Mate or Glenn Greenwald, really, right? And that's where, of course, they hook up with the Tucker Carlsons, where the quote unquote beliefs align. But meanwhile, here is source. This is in the background. This is actually what's behind the Barr move to suppress the evidence of the milquetoast Mueller investigation, which, by the way, we won't go deep into it now, but it looks like every time you see the suppression of more aggressive and serious, deeper accountability that the Mueller group was heading towards in relationship to the Trump administration, it stood down by Mueller's longtime sort of legal body man of some investigative body man of some sort, Aaron Zebley. And see if you can get some serious background on Zebley. It's sort of difficult. Like, you can find some of his public positions, but it's difficult to find out where this deeper background goes. So as we've begun to talk about now too, that in terms of the scope, the limiting of the scope of the investigation, the 11-9 commission, let's call it, right? That's what the Mueller investigation really was the 11-9 commission, right?
And you could argue that there were, maybe some certain possibly compromised figures. Maybe I wonder who the Thomas Keane and the Lee Hamilton of this investigation would be. So you even find some parallels in that regard. And so anyway, I digress.
Well, that's a good point. I think we should probably do that analysis. But just to sum up in terms of what we now know on the surface, in terms of all right, here I'll just give one immediate proposal, that the role of the Philip Zelikow was played by Rod Rosenstein. All right.
There you go.
And because now what when you remember what Rod Rosenstein said? He said that I can land the plane, right? Isn't that what he said? And now we know that what he was talking about was landing the plane without any accountability. And also, I believe he was talking about landing F-35s ultimately, as we see now, further F-35 sales into Israel, and then now they're new partners and all the controversy of delivering the F-35s to the UAE and all of that. So there's a lot of resonance there, because as I was going to say, that Rosenstein played the role of limiting the scope of the Mueller, the 11-9 commission, right? In a similar kind of way that Zelikow had already delivered the architecture of the report itself before the actual investigation really got going, I believe, right? And so that's a piece of it, that the outline of the report was delivered early on by Zelikow, thus in a similar kind of fashion or parallel fashion, limiting the scope of the narrative of the 9/11 Commission in a similar way that now NSO, Israeli Military Cyber Intelligence Company, NSO Group legal representative Rod Rosenstein did with the 11-9 Commission, aka the Mueller investigation. Right. So you have that. So if you have like Rosenstein operating there, Zebly is on the inside, I'd say, of the Mueller investigation, and making sure that every single time that they're going to either confront Trump directly. Remember that I believe also it's coming out that in terms of the investigation into Trump's finances, which is, just as similar to our last recording where we talk about how when Trump sold the house that he sort of stole or elbowed out Epstein from down in Florida, when he sold it to what he saw Bolovlev as a Putin conduit, a Putin cutout. And so the receipt of that extra $50 million of that very shady transaction in terms of what the actual value was there, it's obviously a direct emolument based on the actuality of Trump's finances and Trump's perception of his finances. And so if Zebly was the one that stood down Mueller et al. From deeply going into Trump's finances when Trump said that was off the table, and then the guy who was investigating Mueller and his sidekick here, Zebly, said, oh, it's off the table, fine. We don't want to put up a fight. We don't want to get stuck in court or something like that. And then it's off the table. So, and then finally, Barr. This is what Barr was actually concerned about. This is why Barr was the cleanup operator, ultimately, who framed the entirety of the report more than a month before he even released the heavily censored part of the piece of the report that he did. And Barr was very concerned about exactly these kinds of investigative things. You remember, even when when the Senate was questioning Barr about the report, and I think it was even Kamala Harris who asked him, like, did you look at the evidence behind the charging decision or the evidence behind the report? And Barr sort of skirted it, and ultimately Kamala Harris allowed him to basically not really answer the question or not make the point. But the point is that what was behind all of that is what you've now brought up, Greg, is Nader at the epicenter of bringing together all of these pieces, which includes going back to who brought together Cheney, the epicenter of 9/11 in Iraq War from an American side.
And the man the figure who the Office of Special Plans and the Fife Wormser gang ultimately primarily worked through in the Bush White House as well. So
Chalabi, right? And this is also, we've pointed out this weird connection too, is that Chalabi's nephew was a college roommate of Skull and Bones Mnuchin. Which is interesting. And by the way, we'll reserve some a deeper dive here for when we get into the question of the Oliver Stone scenario. But Oliver Stone's follow-up to Wall Street, to his famous movie Wall Street, which was then Money Never Sleeps, was I believe it was financed by Mnuchin's company at that point. So Mnuchin in college is roommates with a Chalabi nephew. And so there's something, there's a network here, obviously. And so I'm glad we got that onto the table, and we'll follow up with more of that, because there's even more of that where that came from, including that Tony Blair, right, Greg, was at all of these Red Sea conspiracy meetings, it looked like, right?
I believe so. I'm pulling up this information right now. Yes, Tony Blair was at least attended one meeting with the likes of Jared Kushner, Steve Bannon, and Michael Flynn, as well as Mohammed bin Zayed of United Arab Emirates. So,
all right. Let's. I just want to finish up back to the thought of what the heck is going on. What's going to be happening in the next?
Oh, by the way, Marcy Wheeler identifies this meeting. This meeting involving the likes of Kushner, Bannon, Flynn, MBZ, and even Tony Blair as the meeting that Susan Rice had discovered via unmasking, which caused this huge scandal. So,
right, and so Susan Rice should not have been sticking her nose in where it didn't belong, which is in global treason, basically, amongst high-level leaders of multiple different countries, and none of them American in terms of the leadership.
Yeah, and everyone from likely Israeli agent, operative at the very least, Mark Levin, to perhaps more Russian-oriented Rand Paul, all came down with the hammer fist on Susan Rice for that. So,
yep. All right, and so back to this one side of the bifurcated scenario that I can see us facing and potentially coming our way in the next. We'll begin to see the parameters of either one of these paths in the next few days.
And I think we will definitely be referring back to some of the information we just discussed in the near future. So, okay,
good. Yeah, we'll further research it, further digest it, and maybe what we'll do is we'll pull up the originating pages of the FOIA documents and actually go through them on our own and see what we can find in addition to these very good wrap-ups of that. But of course, Nader is crucial to understanding all of this. He of any single individual to understand the operative level of 2016, I think it's Nader really, because he held all of this together at some level. He held the American elements with virtually all of the Middle Eastern elements, including both the Israeli and the Arab components, back tied into a apparent direct back channel to Putin's Kremlin, basically. And so I think that more people who really want to know what happened in 2016 begin to do a deeper dive on George Nader. And of course, Seth Abramson's book, the second book in the Proof trilogy, Proof of Conspiracy, has a large amount of information about what exactly Nader was doing and when. And of course, the whole time through, he's a pedophile, right? And so that needs to be factored in too, in terms of what we now know in terms of Epstein and the global pedophile compromise operation that stands behind a lot of the actual rubber meeting the road leverage, the actual political leverage of these kinds of operations in a very interpersonal way. So any last comments on this sort of area?
I guess to me, this I think this might fill in a couple of just real quick, just thinking about it, just connect. I think it serves to connect perhaps a couple of dots and raises some more questions. But I was thinking it connects the dot and possibly answers the question of why someone like John Hanna, Dick Cheney's chief of staff, was being investigated in relation to the Middle East in the Mueller during the Mueller probe, within the Mueller investigation. So I would think it would come back to this, and it would come back to something that was at the very center of the not just the 2016 operation, but also even going back to the height of the lead up to the Iraq War and all the lies that were told and perpetuated and spread in the lead up to that. And I would also look at, it's very interesting when you think of George Nader and this common area where he appears to have been the man, United Arab Emirates, Mohammed bin Zayed's envoy, perhaps diplomat of some type to both Russia and Israel. And this would bring up a question of me with, I go back to thinking, this is just me thinking out loud, but George Nader being, of course, of Lebanese descent. And also we've talked in the past about the former Office of Special Plans, Feith Wormser partner, some sort, Michael Malouf, also of Lebanese descent, who since moved on to RT to serve as like a primary, almost pro-Trump kind of foreign policy, geopolitical propaganda voice from a Russian perspective, the American acting in terms of a Russian perspective. And also we identified a while back how Franklin Foer in a New York magazine had identified Michael Malouf as the primary source of information to Judith Miller of the New York Times, the infamous primary propagator and spreader of the weapons of mass destruction propaganda and lead up to the war. And so this raises the question for me, I think there's something to look at in terms of like this whole Russian aspect of this operation, and somebody like George Nader being in place to introduce Cheney and Chalabi, and both obviously right at the epicenter of the Office of Special Plans and the Feith Wormser gang that was at play in lead up to the war. So I wonder if there's some information that could come out of that, and what could be found, like really looking more into that. With now we see George Nader, per his own admission, and I don't know why he would just randomly make something like that up in the course of a deposition. I mean, it's kind of a wild accusation to make up in terms of talking about like Trump Russia in 2016, that he introduced Cheney to Ahmed Chalabi. So I think there's a couple areas that I think in the future we can start look more into in terms of this aspect of the investigation, even trying to maybe bring in a more like Russian-centric perspective in terms of like the coming together of narratives when it comes to, say, Russia and Israel and this Arab alliance that has been formed over the last several years. And I guess also I would point out once and for all, with the attendance of like people like Steve Bannon, who's the head of the Breitbart propaganda operation, which on one hand is very, very Israeli-centric, but also still pays lip service to non-interventionism and keeping America out of foreign conflicts. You realize, part of my French, just how much bullshit is in that claim of like, oh, we're fighting the neocons and the people who want to, the warmongers, when they're directly, the Steve Bannons of the world and the Eric Princes of the world are directly in contact with, at a very deep level, the primary propagandists behind the most destructive and the most insidious and the most dangerous elements of the Bush era direct war on terror propaganda post 9/11. So
yes, and as we pointed out before, that the hardcore kinetic so-called warfare of the 9/11 wars, i.e. the stage of the war on terror that fits very much within the white paper context of things like the clean break doctrine or the updated documents that were pointed to that were in the Pentagon, on a desk in the Pentagon that General Wesley Clark saw post 9/11, or on back to something like the Oded Yinon so-called plan, which was the deep Israeli state's machinations thinking forward about their involvement in the region. And so we've already seen the vast portion of that. And so then what's easily done for both the Bannons and the Trumps is that, okay, because Trump hasn't started some big old new hot war, yet at the same time he's escalating the actual expansion of the war on terror, not only in terms of the expansion of the war, the drone strikes and operations on the ground in Africa, but also in the Middle East, including Yemen, and his major compromise support for Saudi Arabia's involvement there. But even thinking in terms of his first trip as a president to the Middle East, and he goes to Saudi Arabia before Israel, right? And they deliver the Palantir, I think, the symbol of the orb and the vast screens of the cyber quote unquote security architecture to the Saudi intelligence services, and the picture there, right, with Trump and MBS, I think, right, and then also Al-Sisi, the infamous picture of all of them touching the globe. Yes, and it's often not talked about that it's Al-Sisi is there on the left side of that of that picture. And that's crucial too, in terms of that recent, the recent release of the information about that it was this Egyptian bank that was funneling money into the Trump campaign, apparently. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of stuff there too, actually, about micropayments that they were using to wash like dark money. Post Citizens United, basically, it's not only domestic dark money that's been flowing in to campaigns that play out all the way up to the Supreme Court, as Senator Sheldon Whitehouse pointed out in the Amy Coney Barrett hearings. But also, it's now increasingly transnational, very likely black money, organized criminal money being washed into American politics. And so I forget what Andy Kawaja or something like that is there's an interesting article about what he has said was going on, that they were washing vast amounts of money from around the world via micropayments into a Trump campaign in 2016. So we'll put that aside for now. But my sort of central point here, in terms of what you talked about, Greg, about what this revelation means around Trump and Bannon and the war on terror and the background of the Iraq war, is that it's all marketing in terms of the anti-war cred of Trump, especially, as you point out, if you throw then an Eric Prince into the mix, and that what we're really talking about, and this is also where like a lot of the left who wrings their hands about the new Cold War with either Russia. If you're Ben Norton, then basically the choice between Trump and Biden is basically, who do you want the new Cold War with? Do you want it with China or do you want it with Russia? And meanwhile, a similar kind of architecture is there, I would say, is that there's a continuity of agenda of the global war on terror, which all of these so-called nemesis, China, Russia, and the United States of America, with this partner, Israel, right in the epicenter as a nodal point, really, as a transit point, both geographically and geopolitically, are all on board with and escalating it and using it to further control and surveil and lay out the architecture for Skynets on their own domestic populations, but also in relationship to the so-called third world, which again is basically just a replica of the original Cold War in many ways. Is that, yes, certain people wanted to actually throw down with a hot nuclear war, people surrounding Khrushchev, people surrounding Kennedy. They did want to do that. And there were times where it could have gone that way. But my sense, especially of this new Cold War, is it's not actually meant to be a hot war between Russia and the United States or China and the United States. I'm sure some people probably in the mix have that kind of impetus. However, what likely is the plan is the furtherance of the ongoing war on terror. And now with this new escalated rubric of the biological threat of COVID-19 and the future pandemics and the amount of, health-based tyranny that can be done under that pretext. And then when you combine that with the threat of bioterrorism, right, that is the architecture that really exposes what the people behind Trump and the people such as Eric Prince, as this intermediary so-called logistics guy, a former Blackwater, right, military contractor, logistics guy, in the middle of all of this escalation architecture for the rest of this so-called new American century. Okay, so one last thing I wanted to point out, Greg, about this crucial point you make about the background of Maloof and Judith Miller, is that this all fits in too with this analysis that I just proposed in terms of the next generation of the Cold War as much more based on global cyber war, global war on terror, and then biological, whether quote unquote and of quote unquote natural origin, which is obviously, I think, a fraudulent pretext around COVID, which has a lot of elements that point to it having been constructed for some reason by someone in a laboratory somewhere. But then even on top of that, the threat of bioterrorism on top of it. And then so in the midst of all of that, who is Judith Miller? Not just the key New York Times propagandist for the Iraq War, but she played the role of a journalist in the war game Dark Winter in the summer before September 11th, right? At the same time as someone like James Woolsey, a very interesting character in the midst of the 2016 operation too, played the role of the former CIA director, played the role of the CIA director, I think. So is it possible that Judith Miller was also just playing the role of the journalist when she was the journalist at the New York Times? I'd say obviously. And then this connection then with Malouf. And remember, Malouf is not just now Russia Today, but he's also in this sort of what's seen as the Iranian sphere in terms of the New Horizon Conference and the confluence of interests there that include people from the Veterans Today sphere, False Flag Weekly News sphere like Kevin Barrett, but also, former U.S. intelligence people like Scott Bennett being at the table there along with Dugin, but also people like Phil Giraldi now fully sort of ensconced in like the UNS review kind of set basically.
Everything is simply neocon provocation against Russia.
And remember what Dugin, remember what I caught on video from that thing and then shared with Joseph Davis basically back in the Talpiot Talk days, is that Dugin at one of those previous New Horizon conferences made a speech about how the turning point for the multipolar order, and I think he used the words basically multipolar, the axis of resistance, so-called, against the evil West and the evil U.S. empire was 9/11. He said it specifically. And then I couple that with the video that I found of Putin being asked about he was asked by some young student, I think, about the moon landing, the U.S. moon landing as being a potential hoax. And Putin shifted it. He's like, that's as crazy as saying that 9/11 was a fraud of some sort, which was very interesting to hear from Putin. So all of that to say, if it very much is evidence for what I'm saying about this new Cold War, so-called, between, the nemesis of China, Russia, and the United States, is every single one of those countries are down with this much larger plan. And at the very most, you could say is that leaders like the highest levels in China and Russia are basically at the most, they're the dogs that didn't bark. But it's beyond that because they are players in it, whether it's the expansion of the architecture of oppression and repression domestically in both those places, each in their own specific way, or then the facilitation of things like Russian imperialism in Africa or Chinese economic imperialism via such initiatives as the Belt Road Initiative that are then also coupled with the very specific kind of state-based capitalist predatory lending, right? Even up to like where the Israelis, I think, gave over some kind of debt obligations to one of their ports to the Chinese in the mix of all of that. And so Malouf should be looked at in relationship to that in much larger sphere globally, that also then immediately hooks back into not only the Office of Special Plans and the architecture of the fraudulent war on Iraq, but also then this question of the biological threat background, even behind September 11th, that Judith Miller, in her role in Dark Winter, was obviously then involved with. And of course, the connection there is that what was the role that Judith Miller played in helping the propaganda arm of the war on terror crime? She was the one who pushed the biological threat from Iraq, right? So I think that understanding this background of these networks is even more important now than it might have even been 10 years ago.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And also, I'll throw in one more name for Maloof that I think figures into this bigger network. More Israeli, actually, it seems to be more Zionist Israeli, certainly Council for National Policy oriented, is that Michael Maloof also was a primary contributor to WorldNet Daily, run by Joseph Farah, which is kind of a primary epicenter of this combination of extreme, like evangelical Christian Zionism, meshed in with some messianic Jewish sentiments, and American, conservative American patriotism combined with paying a lot of lip service to like the similar kind of language, a little more conspiratorial based than say Breitbart is, but very similar in kind of that vein of like Zionist oriented media that pays lip service to like the ideas of like, American, staying out of interventionism in foreign countries. And so you also add in like WorldNet Daily is another primary conduit of propaganda over the years as well. And so that's another layer to the Michael Maloof side of the puzzle in terms of going back into that whole realm of things.
That's a good point. Like people like Jerome Corsi and Michael Maloof represent the intersectionality, the intersectionality between like the highest levels of the U.S. government, right? Jerome Corsi, State Department, Michael Maloof, Pentagon, and then these so-called alternative media, the sort of secret right associated, CMP associated, alternative right-wing media, such as Corsi is involved with to this day. And Maloof is, too, in relationship to the certain angle and bent of a Russian state media in the age of Trump. So last thing I wanted to say in terms of this Maloof Russia Today thing is how stunning it is now that we just saw Trump's so-called herd immunity czar. What's his name again, Greg?
Scott Atlas.
Okay. Greg, can you state?
I'm sorry, Scott Atlas.
No, that's cool. There was some fumbling with the microphone sounds going on. That's okay. Okay, sorry. Okay, Scott Atlas, the herd immunity czar, was just on Russia Today proudly, basically demeaning the approach of prevention and masks. And while people have pointed out that at the very same time that Russia now has a mask policy, and so. That is fairly stunning at this point, too, I would say. All right. So
I agree with you.
So back to this question of this one pathway that we're facing of that the people like Rove, John McLaughlin, and then Uri Geller represent as a tripartite data set, basically, of this crew making some kind of push. And so I was pointing out that polling is very often used as just another part of psychological warfare. Now, it's not always that. It's not always used as that. I'm sure there are actual real pollsters out there that are actually trying to get an accurate sense of what's going on. But very often, the most effective polling is what's called exit polling in terms of elections. And it's usually seen as it's highly accurate. And so that's after the fact. And it usually is used around the world to check whether there was any shenanigans going on. But meanwhile, in modern day, the United States of America, those all went out the window, I believe, in 2016. And there was all kinds of hand-wringing at the highest levels of the media about what could explain the apparent divergence of the quote-unquote actual results from the exit polling. So exit polling is, sure, there's ways where it can go bad. Certain people might be trying to hide who they voted for, or there's public shaming of voting for certain people. That can happen. But if done in really well, it's highly, highly accurate. But what I'm saying is in the way that people like Karl Rove or John McLaughlin, for example, use polling, I see it as very much marketing at the very best and psychological warfare and black propaganda more likely and at the very worst. And then finally you have a Uri Geller kind of figure who's just very strange. It's sort of like seen as a sort of pseudo-psychic kind of guy, the guy who can bend spoons with his mind, allegedly. And yet there's this very strange Israeli intelligence connection with him. He's sort of the articulated id of some aspect of a certain set of Israeli intelligence is what it looks like to me. And so he then represents another level of the articulation of this grouping, I think, that their intent is for Trump to be announced the winner in this election by hook or by crook, more likely by crook, I'd say, in terms of what's going on here. And so if that's the case, then the signs that that's going on is going to be Karl Rove on television saying, wait for it. There's something's happening in some pocket of Pennsylvania that we didn't think about, or there's something happening down in Florida or Georgia that we didn't think about, or, so watch for those kind of turns on television on election night, and then watch for the content, the deep push by the Trump administration and the Republican Party more generally into legal battles very, very quickly. In that case, there's going to be a serious drawn out fight. And to me, it's very likely that it's going to be based upon an election fraud scenario and the stealing of the election, in which case the American people are going to have a serious immediate choice about what their commitment is to the actual republic and the rule of law. So that's one way we could go, I think. And then the second way I can see us going is that here's some other data points that suggest this, is that the people who backed Trump, let's say, have relinquished at some level, especially those that are highly Israeli interested, such as, for example, Biden's chosen advisor on Israel is, I believe, Dan Shapiro, who was Obama's ambassador, I think, at one point to Israel. And it's pointed out by people like Phil Weiss and Mondo Weiss that Shapiro should probably register as a foreign agent under the FARA Act, basically. And then on top of that, when we saw the way that Netanyahu responded to Trump on speakerphone in the Oval Office when Trump was looking for ego stroking and assurance in the run up to the election, that Netanyahu saw Trump as his greatest asset ever, really, in terms of, Bibi, no one else, right, other than me could have helped us do this great
Sleepy
peace
Joe
deals.
couldn't do it.
Oh, right. That's right. Sleepy Joe, Bibi, Sleepy Joe could never have pulled off these incredible, beautiful deals, right? And then, so he was expecting it. And then Bibi comes back and basically says, Donald, we will work with whoever in the United States of America who wants to help us create peace.
It almost felt like a bit of a hedging of bets, because previously, like, Netanyahu's always gone out of his way, like above and beyond to stroke Trump's ego. He did not in this case. It almost felt like a hedging of bets almost. It's almost like, Israelis strategically are like, well, we might not have this anymore, so we're going to have to try and soothe it, because that's something like the U.S.-Israel relationship has taken a major hit because of like the rightward shift in Israel and the alliance that's really been made with the GOP here in the U.S. And so, I think there is a hedging of bets. And almost similarly, recently, I think Putin was quoted along the lines of saying like, well, we can work with either candidate, like Putin openly mentioning the benefits of working with either Trump or Biden. So I think you get a sense of like a hedging of bets almost in both Russia and Israel. Perhaps.
That's a great point, Greg, because it's true. Putin not only said that he could, work with Biden, but he also went out of his way to push back on the question of Russian compromise on Biden in terms of the way it's being put forward around the Moscow connection and all of that. And so that's pretty interesting. You're right. So that those two data points with Netanyahu and Putin, who are so close, they're basically the two. If there's two main foreign leaders who are involved in helping install Trump in 2016, those are the two, really. And sure, there's some other really key involvement of especially some of the Arab leaders like MBS and MBZ, and then probably Al-Sisi, and maybe others too. And
maybe Erdogan as well. Turkey's still a mystery.
Point. That's a good point. Yeah, and Turkey's always shifting around, it seems like. So those points would suggest that at the very least they are hedging, as you say. But even the Netanyahu thing seemed even stronger than hedging to me, because I got the sense that if he were actually hedging, he would have done the ego stroke first and said, you've done great things for us. Thank you so much, Mr. President. We are willing to work with anybody who will be our friend towards peace in the Middle East, in the United States of America. But he didn't do that. And this is why what you saw was Trump, a dejected face. And, and so I think that there are some indicators that they've actually resigned to that it's potentially the case that there's too much votes already taken place with too much of a potential Biden lead, and that even on election day that it's not within the realm of the stealing, which has to be more. It's harder to steal an election that's beyond 5%. Once you get into 5 to 10% difference, it's much harder. People can even go and look at the interview with Benny Smith that Jennifer Cohn did, or the election integrity panel that I recently moderated on No Lies Radio that included both Jennifer Cohn and Benny Smith, where Benny Smith explains how he figured out some of this stuff, the way that it actually operates at the county level in terms of what he calls fraction magic. And the way that it can be done is they can basically just sort of shift over certain fractions, just fractions of votes in every single precinct, right? And so it can't be seen at a larger level when it's spread out. But once you get into larger differences, differentials, then it becomes much more difficult to steal. And it's not the case that it wouldn't be done, but it becomes a little more ostentatious and outrageous, really, to be able to try to pull that off. So, and they may try to do that, but my sense of it is that sure, there's still a very strong Trump base out there, and they're going to vote. They're going to vote hard, but there's a much larger sense that there a large swaths of the American people have grown very concerned with what Trump has actually done to the country beyond sort of some tax cuts that they immediately got a little bit of benefit from. And so I guess we're going to see, but my sense is that if the sort of Netanyahus and the Putins have relinquished at some level and they're hedging their bets now, then what we're going to see is the potential of a general relinquishing of the election in a much quicker fashion, and there won't be as much of a struggle. There's still going to be some stochastic stuff, I think, happening in a very local fashion at the very least. Supposedly Bill Barr's been going around talking to all of the police departments in a fairly covert fashion, and people are boarding up all around the country. And obviously there's the will to fight in the streets between the Antifa types and the Proud Boy types all around. But if it's this route and there's basically a retrenchment of interest, let's call it, then Israel itself is going to become more front and center. And so I would say at that point, we then have to immediately shift directly into the question of the Democratic Party cover-up of the 11/9 operation. And so we will look directly into the backgrounds and the motivations of people like Nancy Pelosi, yes. Right, Craig?
Yes, and and this is a perfect segue to start to wrap up the show with this particular discussion. And regarding the election, I mean, we look at like Putin and Netanyahu, this perhaps even more than hedging of bets, as you pointed out. But ultimately, the time will tell, because, I mean, on the ground, at least on the surface, pretty much all of the major players who worked in the 2016 operation, particularly from a domestic propaganda perspective, whether it would be, the John McLaughlin type pollster, or even Karl Rove from the Bush era operation, who was not solidly pro-Trump in 2016, but has completely come into the picture. So, and as well as the media, I mean, the same, the media elements are still largely at play. So from that perspective, I mean, all the major, seems like, operators from a propaganda perspective domestically are still, working, it seems, very hard for Trump. So, I mean, we'll see. We'll see what actually happens there. But, and I will say, anybody who claims to know what's going to happen, I mean, honestly, no one knows. And anybody who says they know exactly what's going to happen is not being honest with you. So, I mean, we'll just have to wait and see. And I mean, we keep, honestly, we cannot dismiss worst case scenarios, but also try to keep a sense of optimism as well. And I think one way we can try to avoid like the gloom and doom of, oh my God, the sky is falling in this election and the kind of almost unprecedented domestic situation in terms of a modern day presidential politics, national election, is to look at, and this is something, we're looking at what you're getting into here with the with the issue of the Democrats, is looking ahead into the future, into a possible Biden-Harris presidential administration and what that would look like, particularly in terms of the question of what we're going to discuss here and how this dynamic we're about to discuss would relate to an Obama-era decision. Do you look forward or backward? Obama says we're going to look forward, and we're not going to look backward in terms of seriously investigating the Bush-era criminality in terms of the lies of the war on terror and both the domestic and global repercussions of that. And so we ask a similar question in this age with all of the criminality of like this Trump operation. Is a Biden-Harris administration going to look forward or backward? And this brings up the question of a very serious concern, a very serious thing that needs to be addressed of the Democratic leadership, both Biden and Harris. I mean, you look at Biden and Harris, Joe Biden, a long-term favorite, I would say, of Joe, I'm a Zionist Biden, long-term favorite of the representative of the Zionist lobby's interest in Washington. And then Kamala Harris, another favorite of particularly the AIPAC-oriented Democratic establishment in the Senate. And then what we're about to get into with the question of various members of Congress, House, the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, same position she was in under Bush when she pushed back people like Dennis Kucinich who were pushing for articles of impeachment. And then she was also in this role at the beginning of the Obama administration before the Republicans took over the House as well. And then in addition to that, obviously the people we've identified as leading away and perhaps limiting the scope of the 2016 investigation in Congress, such as Adam Schiff and Gerald Nadler. And so this question, what we're about to get into, becomes of like the look forward or look backward question. And I would say for very serious researchers out there who are very much, I think, on the ball in terms of understanding what's going on with the depths of this Trump operation and the bigger picture around it, you really have to look at the Democrats and how is a Democratic administration going to handle the aftermath of this. Are they going to look forward or backward? And this is a very serious question.
It is. And before we delve into that just a little bit, before we close for this evening, I would just want to say that that will be on the table if this Biden-Harris situation is the pathway that we end up going down. But it's totally plausible that the other one might happen. And in that case, and even analysis per se, in terms of the deeper, thicker, detailed, more expansive and historically interested kind of analysis that we do and will continue to do at the Antedote, may go out the window for a certain amount of time, because it's actually going to be about the potential of American people's direct willpower and direct action in relationship to their own potential protection of the republic and the possibility for a rule of law moving forward, and for real politics to play a role in that. If it actually turns out to be an overt putsch re-election based on stealing of all sorts, whether it's ground violence, stochastic kind of chaos operations going on, combined with voter suppression, combined with machine rigging, combined with weaponized polling announcements, combined with lawfare and the usage of the use and abuse of the courts on up to the newly installed Amy Coney Barrett, as Trump basically just shouted out the Supreme Court the other day in the middle of his speech about luckily we have the Supreme Court and that'll be settled quickly, he basically said in the wake of the election. So I'm just saying, Greg, it may be that this entire area may go out the window immediately in terms of our immediate concerns, both as we the Antedote, but both also as we the American people, if we have to immediately face the question of a solidification of an actual dictator putsch, basically. and the solidification of this Trump operation based on a stealing of the election. So we can table that motion for now, depending on what we see coming up in the next week, in order to then address, okay, let's say that it is this Biden-Harris situation that we're facing, then what kind of analysis do we need to immediately unpack at that point? So let's go for that a little bit.
All right, let's do it.
All right, so one thing, of course, is that, as you pointed out, both Biden and Harris are obviously have deeply involved Israeli backgrounds. Let's talk about the foreign influence operation, because that was so front and center with 2016. It was the most transnationally oriented election I think that we've ever had by far, in terms of all of the layers of the operations. Not that there hasn't been some involvement before, especially in terms of the persistent, quote unquote, involvement by the Israeli so-called lobby, where they've involved themselves in all kinds of ways, right, including on up to assassinations of American presidents. That's a pretty severe intervention in an election. It's a pretty severe November surprise. You know, it was a different November, but it was the November before, but it was still a November surprise, right? That the highest levels, very obviously, of certain aspects of the Israeli security state were involved in taking out an American, teaming up, let's say, with certain domestic elements, maybe other foreign elements too, as we might get into, Greg. We'll do our JFK investigation this year, no matter what happens. Let's commit to that, right? Okay. So
yes, I think so.
So we'll do that. But the specific characters involved here, in terms of Biden and Harris, it is the case, that early on I proposed that the choice of the sort of the newly woke neoliberal identity politics, J Street friendly AIPAC lobby was, of all the entirety of the Democratic field, was Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg. And it turned out they were pretty interesting. Buttigieg was a more convincing candidate, it actually turned out, for president, whereas Harris sort of petered out, very low percentage polling. So she was not going to be the president. And then Buttigieg ultimately, he was in play in Iowa early on. And there was also that, of course, that very interesting Sanders Buttigieg scenario going on in Iowa in the background of the shadow app and all of that. And maybe we'll revisit that at some point or not. That may be history that's sort of not as important frontally at this point. But it is very interesting that someone like Kamala Harris ultimately rose and was chosen in this position as vice president, because she does have the most liberal, quote unquote, liberal voting record as assessed by some groups, but maybe by the ACLU or something like that, in the Senate, more so than Bernie Sanders. I've hypothesized, and I haven't looked at it, but I imagine it's somewhere in the realm of maybe gun votes that makes her more liberal than Sanders, coming from Vermont.
They're gonna take your guns away.
So, but meanwhile, it's so interesting too, like, so how she's like the prosecutor, and obviously there's the most concerning domestic aspect of me of Harris is the personality, not only the actual policy background, but the personality of the dirty prosecutor, where it's very obvious there's a background there where if the facts come up differently, that she will not actually try to do what's right for justice in terms of people that she's prosecuted, but she will do what's right for the quote unquote prosecutorial record. And there's certain things in her public personality that strike me as having that kind of sociopathic bent. So that I'm very concerned about that, especially in relationship domestically around things like the COVID biosurveillance architecture that we're going to be facing that conversation and that debate intensely in 2021, no matter what, no matter who's in office. So that's going to be frontally on the table. And I'm very concerned about Harris's I can see Harris as a Dick Cheney in a domestic fashion in relationship to something like that. But tying back into what we are dealing with in these more transnational or foreign policy influences, her relationship to the Israel lobby is so front and center, And so that, I think, is what we're going to need to delve into. And we'll just touch on a little bit of it now. And that is with Nancy Pelosi, for example. Let's just touch a little bit on this background of Nancy Pelosi, Greg. Do you want to do some of that?
Yes, we do. Yes, because I think Pelosi becomes a seminal figure in terms of like her role in terms of the Democratic leadership, and almost like Democratic leadership's complete acquiescence of its dereliction of its duties in terms of like. And look, this is not to absolve the Democrats of their own obviously issues, but I mean, in terms of like the Democrats' dereliction duty with obvious like criminality coming from, say, the Republican side, particularly with the Bush era war on terror and what we're seeing now with the Trump era. And so, Nancy Pelosi becomes a seminal figure to understand. I mean, we just via the magic of social media discovered some very, very interesting, I would say very telling, important information about Nancy Pelosi and her family.
Yes, and you can go look at Ben Franklin 2018 on Twitter, yes, and then the aforementioned Sarah Kendzior that you did, Greg, on Twitter, to really get some of this background of Nancy Pelosi and her family. And her father, a lot has been made of her statement about how, and you say that this was, it looks like Chuck Schumer was there with, then it's a Hayam Saban conference.
I'm not sure if it was him or not. It looked like him, but it may not have been Schumer.
Okay. But the main thing about that is her statement that our support for Israel is so firm that it will exist beyond even if or after our capital crumbled to the ground, or something as serious as that. And then also people have talked about, obviously she's very seriously AIPAC oriented, but also her father's role as a Shabbos Goy. But it's way beyond that. Her father is basically and you can find this in some of the threads from Ben Franklin 2018. And you might want to just pay attention to him, especially in terms of this, the former scenario that I was talking about, a potential election steal. And he's one of the few voices, I'd say, who are actually be speaking plainly about what is actually being faced here in terms of that, and what a lot of the blue checkmark people, even people who do some kind of analysis that resonates with us, such as like people in the narrative sphere and Zev Shalev and some of the people they have on. Like, for example, they had on Andrew Laufer the other day, a sort of insider lawyer type who said that he'd spoken with some Republican Party operatives, consultants, it sounded like election consultants, who'd gone in at the last moment to meet with the Trump campaign at the White House, I think, to see if they could really give it a last minute revival. And that the phrase was, Trump is finished, right? And so as we pointed out, and even if you point to some stuff with Trump at times when he's stumping in the recent days, he seems fairly resigned. He said it could have been the best. We could have been the greatest, but too bad. And he does seem to be sort of opening the door to losing potentially a little bit. But as I pointed out to Shalev and Laufer, it doesn't really matter whether Trump is finished. It matters who the people that back him, whether they're finished. Because obviously Trump might have been finished in November 2016, ready to go and create a Trump channel and really, self-aggrandize and self-promote and bring in some newly acquired, transnationally oriented wealth into his businesses after running for president. And yet there he was, put into the White House, very likely at the hands of the people behind him. So people like that, who basically say he's finished, or other blue checkmark people who basically say the rule of law will, he'll be out of there even if he loses, they'll have to follow the law. And so what we're pointing out, in addition to like what people like Sarah Kendzior or Ben Franklin are pointing out, is that the Democrats themselves, the people who were in charge of the oversight, the equal branch of the government, right? They were supposed to be the ones. This is how you deal with a president that is enacting criminal policy, enacting criminal acts, is that it's through impeachment. It's through the legislative branch. And they failed to even do the investigations, really, let alone the actual accountability. And you referenced that a little bit earlier, Greg, in terms of, Pelosi having to at some point submit to a potential to the impeachment. But it was the most milquetoast impeachment, and it was at the last possible moment, and it was done in as ineffective and ineffective way as possible. Okay.
Yeah.
And
by the way, it was Chuck Schumer with Pelosi and Haim Saban on stage at the Israeli-American Council where Pelosi made her comments.
All right. Well, thanks for filling that in. And so basically, Ben Franklin, 2018, in one of his threads, points out that during the rise of organized crime in this country, especially in relationship to when like the Jewish mob was beginning to turn the tables, as we've seen it, as turning the tables on the Italian American mafia, that at that point, the mayors of port cities in the United States of America, i.e., remember what we've talked about in terms of shipping, things like Southern Air Transport, Leslie Wexner, truck shipping, plane shipping, key to if you're trying to ship black economy things such as arms or drugs or human trafficking victims around the world, you need to have access to shipping, right? i.e. the ports. So Nancy Pelosi's father, I believe, was the mayor of Baltimore during this key periods. And actually her brother was credibly accused of underage rape, right, Greg?
Yes, I believe so. Yes. Franklin Delano Roosevelt D'Alessandro.
Yes. And so he was got off the hook, but apparently the allegations were highly credible. And then so it appears that her father, Nancy Pelosi's father, was deeply tied into the upcoming mob, and additionally highly Israeli tied, where to the point of where I believe in Haifa, somewhere in Haifa, there's a sports complex named after him in a way that Chris Roulon pointed out is very similar to the way that things are named after James Jesus Angleton, the kind of American traitors who are willing to do the bidding of the Israeli security state.
Thomas D'Alessandro Stadium. The stadium was built with help from it is the home stadium of I don't know how to pronounce this word, Hapoel Haifa's youth team. So it's basically a global football American soccer stadium. And the stadium was built with help from the Jewish community of Baltimore, Maryland, and named for the mayor of Baltimore, Thomas D'Alessandro.
Well, thank you for that. And I guess we should wrap up here, but we just want to put that on the table. And really what should be seen now is that it's a mob government at most serious levels. And whether it's from Nancy Pelosi or to Kellyanne Conway, look at the parents there. Or as we pointed out, as the father of the former Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy, or his son Justin's relationship at Deutsche Bank with Rosemary Grabler and Trump and the Trump loans and all of that. But Kennedy's father was seen as one of the key mob lawyers / I think ultimately a judge in California, West Coast context. Okay. So it's a government by mob. It is a mafia state at some level. And so the question now is whether we want to reconstruct ourselves a republic out of what has become a covert mafia state. It's not overt. And that's actually sort of the choice, I think, right now is if the Trump people go for the steal, I think then we basically go to overt mafia state. And then if the Biden people are allowed to win it, then we continue with the covert mafia state. And then either way, we're going to need to confront the mob that controls our national security operations, i.e. the real deep state that the people that back Trump have totally destroyed as a term and as a concept. But we will not give it up, because we will continue to use it properly as the way that language should be used, plainly and honestly. So we will turn back to all of this stuff in the future and try to fill it out, right, Greg?
Yes, and I could not agree with you more. And that's the thing, like people who just think that this ends with Trump, and it does not, because obviously this is a new level of like, foreign geopolitical, multinational intrigue going on, to say the least. But this does not begin or end with Trump. We also have to remember at the end of the day that it is by and large this bipartisan, corrupt domestic and foreign policy establishment of Republicans and Democrats, of the Pelosi, Schumer, Feinstein, Biden, Clinton class of neoliberal Democrats, among others, who have directly paved the way for the rise of this Donald Trump operation in terms of doing enough damage domestically that people would fall behind someone like Trump. And so we cannot forget that as well. And I think this ultimately does go back to this question of what you're talking about with these very highly connected Democratic leadership, and just how compromised and corrupted they are by many of the same interests, as well as like even the represented by the overly corrupt elements of the Trump operation. So,
yep. And final thing I'd say is that my proposal has been, I call it tar, no feather. Rather than people like to talk about truth and reconciliation in South Africa, it didn't really work out that well. Sure, they made a more peaceful transition out of the apartheid government, but they didn't have accountability, and accountability would include the elements of the powers that were then coming into power, right? So what I have proposed, I call it tar, no feather. And there's neither tar, no feather, nor feathers involved. It stands for truth, accountability, restitution, then reconciliation. And we can then talk about what all of that means. And by accountability, I don't mean like just a public mea culpa. I mean legal, lawful accountability that has standing and that has a value of dissuading future international, national level criminality. And then in the future, we can discuss what my sense of what that means about restitution, and then who do you reconcile with? There's certain people need to go to jail. You don't reconcile with them. But others who may have been sort of gone along to get along, especially if they're willing to give up the crucial information about what they knew, then especially political reconciliation in terms of we, the American people, we're not interested in these hyped up, because really when they talk about civil war, I see that as largely really nasty, violent-oriented, chaotic propaganda being pushed by certain elements embedded in the left, but most obviously like people like Alex Jones and now the Stuart Rhodes and all of that, who sort of talk about the live fly civil war aspects. I don't think that's actually what's going on. We, the American people, don't want that. But at the same time, we're already involved in hybrid civil war of some sort. And we've been drawn into it. And so we need to figure out how to extricate ourselves. And so that's the kind of reconciliation I'm talking about, is a full political spectrum reconciliation at the same time as we are pursuing truth and accountability. All right. So I guess until next time, Greg.
All right. And we will, definitely. We're entering I would say interesting is such an understatement. I mean, but it's definitely interesting among a number of other terms that could be used for what we're about to enter into. And so, when I think we will definitely be doing, I think we're definitely going to be upping our workload and our output here in the next month or so. Definitely we'll try to do some election, follow-ups and analysis of what's going on in terms of what we see play out over the next few weeks. But also, as you said, the Kennedy deep dive, which is something that we really want to get into, regardless of what goes on with the election. So be looking forward to that in conjunction with the upcoming 11/22 anniversary. And I do believe we might join our friend, the invitation is open to join our friend John Brisson on his channel for an election night, live election night coverage. So regardless, we will definitely be back with something here in the very, very near future, and be looking out because definitely going to be much more coming out from us. I'd say this month than has been in the last few months. So,
all right, Godspeed, God brave, long live the Republic, or relive the Republic, whichever way it may be. Antedote, we out. Till next time.